Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's California Mobility Center webinar, California Incentive Roadmap, Navigating California's Billions of Dollars of Investment in Advanced Transportation. Everyone is in listen-only mode. However, you are encouraged to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A function. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available to all CMC members following the presentation. At this time, I would like to turn this webinar over to CMC's Chief Operating Officer, Mark Rawson.
Morning, everybody. Welcome to the December monthly Thought Leadership webinar. I'm very excited today to have return guests to our monthly webinar. The team from California Strategies had presented to the membership and public several months ago about what's happening in California relative to the very large investments that the state's making in vehicle and zero emission vehicle and charging infrastructure deployment. Since that last webinar, both the California Air Resources Board and the California Energy Commission have progressed on exactly how they intend to make those investments in the various programs that they have. I'm very excited to have the team from California Strategies back to present more details about where the state's headed specifically with those large investments. We have Ted Harris, Claire Van Zuden, and Charles Watson. California Strategies is a strategic partner of the CMC, as well as provides commercialization services to CMC early stage companies that we serve as clients. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to the CalStrat team. And if you have questions, I'll be monitoring that across the discussion and may inject those questions into the dialogue as we go along. I'll turn it over to you guys.
Great, thank you, Mark. Hi, this is Ted Harris, partner at California Strategies. And today we're walking through a roadmap of California incentives. Next slide, please. So just as quick background, I'm part of California Strategies and Advocacy, one of California's leading advanced transportation, zero emission vehicle, full service, government relations and lobbying firms. And the general services we provide are both assisting the grants and incentives, helping secure vehicle certifications, both for the vehicles as well as for programs like the Hybrid Vehicle Incentive Program, the HVIP program. We facilitate the state fleet deployments, both directly with agencies as well as the Department of General Services. And then we advocate for zero emission vehicle funding, both at legislature, within the administration, and help support funding to go to agencies like the Air Resources Board, Energy Commission, CPUC, which is the California Public Utilities Commission. Also, an important role, California being so large, being so important, and having so many great programs throughout the state, is really a conduit or connection and creating partnerships with the governor's office, key lawmakers, and all of the key agencies, both on zero emission vehicle funding as well as autonomous vehicles and all things advanced transportation. And a big part of our name as Strategies, and a big part of what we do, are really develop and help implement comprehensive strategies that help the CMC and help all of our clients achieve their goals. Both deploying as well as commercializing zero emission vehicles and advanced technologies. Next slide. Thank you. So again, I'm Ted Harris, partner at CalStrat, and I lead our energy, environment, and advanced transportation practice. And Claire Van Zuden, who's a core part of our advanced transportation program, leads our grants and incentives practice and specializes in advanced transportation. Then Charles Watson, associate, is a core member of California Strategies and Advocacy, also a key part of our CMC team as well. And he specializes in advanced transportation, energy, environmental issues, and as well as grants and incentives. Next slide, please. So just as a big picture, California is definitely the leader in North America, one of the leaders in the world in advanced mobility. Just as general background, their policy is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, to achieve carbon neutrality in the economy by 2045, And specific zero emission vehicle goals include 1.5 million zero emission vehicles on the road by 2025, installing 200 hydrogen fueling stations and 250,000 battery electric vehicle chargers, including 10,000 fast chargers by 2025, having 5 million zero emission vehicles on the road by 2030, which is just 8 years from now, and having 100% of new sales of passenger vehicles and trucks be ZEVs by 2035, 100% of operating medium and heavy duty trucks and buses be zero emission vehicles by 2045, and then all of the drayage trucks to be zero emission vehicles by 2035, and all of the operating off-road vehicles and equipment to be zero emission by 2035 as well. Next slide, please. Fortunately, with those ambitious goals, there's unprecedented levels of available funding as part of the California Comeback Plan. And overall, there are billions of dollars in there to address both climate change and advanced transportation. And recent funding approvals by agencies include $1.5 billion of investments in low carbon transportation for clean cars, trucks, buses, and mobility options. The Energy Commission has $1.4 billion to invest in clean transportation, clean vehicle infrastructure, and manufacturing. In addition, the federal infrastructure deal includes $7.5 billion for alternative fuel charging and deployment, and $7.5 billion for clean school buses and ferries. So between the Air Resources Board, the Energy Commission, and the federal programs, it's really extraordinarily time in the deployment, the commercialization of zero emission vehicles with unprecedented amount of funding. And the rest of this presentation, I'll hand over to Claire Van Zyden to help walk through how manufacturers and others can hopefully partner with the state and the federal government to achieve those goals.
Perfect, thank you. So now, as Ted mentioned, what we thought we would do is kind of break out the various funding opportunities at the three locations. So California Air Resources Board, California Energy Commission, and the federal government. And so starting first with the California Air Resources Board, as Mark mentioned, the Air Resources Board last month approved its $1.5 billion investment package. And so here's kind of a high level breakout. So $525 million for what's called the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, or CVRP. This is the incentive program specifically for light duty vehicles that provides a voucher for purchasing light duty vehicles. And then there's a new program, approximately $10 million for e-bikes that's included, sort of housed under, if you will, the CVRP program. And then $570 million for HVIP, which is the sort of medium and heavy duty equivalent to the CVRP program, where it provides vouchers for medium and heavy duty trucks and buses. This year, there's a specific set aside for a few different programs. So one set aside is for transit, another for school bus, and another for drayage. And these set asides are to help carry out the recent goals established by Governor Newsom for 1,000 zero emission transit buses, 1,000 zero emission school buses, and 1,000 zero emission drayage trucks. And so to help meet those goals and those numbers, there are specific set asides within HVIP. There's also a set aside this year for a new pilot program for helping small fleets access HVIP funds. And these set asides are really there because in the latest rounds of HVIP over the last few rounds, it's been heavily oversubscribed, meaning that hundreds of millions of dollars are going in just minutes. And so in light of that, with the governor's set priorities and the desire to help small fleets access the HVIP program, there will be set asides for certain vehicle types and certain end users. There's also $195 million for CORE, which is the off-road sort of equivalent of HVIP and CVRP. So this is voucher incentives for off-road equipment. This is significantly more funding than they've had in the past. This is due to the demand for the CORE program. We can get into a little bit more details about how that program may change in the near future. There's also $150 million for transportation equity programs to support clean mobility options, and then $80 million for heavy duty demonstration and pilot projects.
Hey, Claire, quick question
Mhm.
on that slide before you move forward. For some of these set asides, are there existing programs already in place? For example, in this instance with CARB, or do some of these set asides require them to create new programs?
So the set-asides will be within the existing HRIP program itself. And so they'll still be the same voucher amounts. It will just be a way to ensure that a certain percentage or certain funding amount within HRIP will go to these priorities. So for example, at least 70 million will go to transit buses, and at least 130 million will go to school buses of that 570 million.
Got it. So from the standpoint of like efficiency and ability to get the funds dispersed quickly, since they're already in existing programs, that'll not hold them up per se about having to create new delivery channels for these program dollars.
Correct. And I would say with the exception of the 80 million for heavy duty demonstration and pilot projects, which I'll get into the breakout on the next slide, all of these other programs are existing. So to your point, they are able to get the dollars out much more quickly because it's not having to develop new programs, but rather these are dollars that are being infused to existing programs.
Excellent. Thank you.
So we got into CVRP a little bit, and I guess what I should say is these majority of these are existing programs, but each year ARB takes a look at kind of what's working, what's not working, where the market is, how they can get these dollars to extend further, particularly as these programs become more oversubscribed. And so one of the ways of doing that is within the CVRP program, for example, in the funding plan, there are going to be income caps and cost caps for the vehicles that will be phased in. Followed by potential additional updates in February of 2023. And this is all to help the dollars go further and then also help to really target specific low-income customers and communities to be able to access and be able to purchase zero-emission vehicles. You mentioned the set-aside for the e-bikes. This will be a separate program, and this will be a new program that will be developed with the public workshop process. There's already been one workshop that was held in September, and they'll continue to hold workshops to hear from stakeholders in first quarter of next year. For the HRIP program, the new program is expected to open early 2022. The exact date is to be determined. However, ARB did share a notice recently saying that they encouraged folks that needed to get executive orders or needed to get on the HRIP list to do so as quickly as possible, so that way they could process those, get those vehicles on the list, and that way they would be eligible for HRIP funding when it does reopen in early 2022. They're also expected to work on potentially updating the implementation manual, and that's expected to occur potentially this month and early next month. And that implementation manual updates would sort of be, small tweaks or changes to the HRIP program. The core program, this is the off-road voucher program, and that is set to reopen in early Q2 of 2022. They expected to host a workshop this month that got postponed, so we'll likely see it next month. And this workshop is to solicit stakeholder feedback on expanding eligibility for that program. So right now that program, is sort of more in its kind of pilot phase, if you will. This year it got 195 million, recognizing the need to grow the off-road sector and to help further deploy zero-emission vehicles in the off-road sector. And so staff is taking a look at and wanting to hear from stakeholders, what potential additional pieces of eligible equipment that they could include, or potentially ways to help streamline the application process similar to the HRIP program. And then the transportation equity programs. So, this was mentioned in the first slide on ARB and kind of broke out here so that way folks could see, how the funding was going to be allocated within the transportation equity programs. So there's a program called the Clean Mobility Options. This is 20 million that will be available on a first come, first served basis. ARB is updating these program guidance to address some of the equity concerns with the first come, first served basis that occurred in the last round. So this is another existing program. The Sustainable Transportation Equity Project, or STEP, ARB has decided to backfund those previously submitted projects. So there's no new funding for Sustainable Transportation Equity projects for this upcoming year. Clean Cars for All, this is $75 million to expand the program statewide. This is specifically for low-income consumers to replace their older vehicle with a new, cleaner vehicle. And so they retire the older vehicle and then receive an incentive to purchase a new, cleaner vehicle. Clean Mobility in Schools, this too is going to be used to backfund previously submitted projects. So there's no new funding for 2021 for Clean Mobility in Schools. And then financing assistance, this is to support low-income consumers to finance EVs. The $80 million for heavy-duty demonstration and pilot projects, $40 million of the 80 is going to be used to backfund previously submitted zero-emission drayage projects. And then $40 million will be for new off-road pilots with an initial focus on marine, cargo handling equipment, and locomotives. This is one where staff will be hosting workshops for a stakeholder process to develop what that solicitation will look like. So this will be a new program and one to look out for folks interested in marine, cargo handling, or locomotives.
Hey, Claire, we had a question. And I mean, most of these dollars that we see the state making investments in, you know, the preponderance of it is really focused on deployment, whether that be deployment of vehicles or supporting charging, fueling infrastructure. One of the attendees, Ralph, is asking about what if one has a revolutionary new EV concept that may well be jump-started by having the proper endorsement, a project that I expect to market to the VC community to take over from there. Could you maybe speak to the available dollars that the state's bringing forward for maybe what I would say is, you know, technologies that maybe are in the pre-commercial space?
Yeah, so I would say, you know, I don't know that Ted mentioned, but, you know, Ted, Charles, and I have been doing this for quite some time, and Ted and I have been working in the EV space for 12 and 16 years, respectively. It's a long time within the zero emission space. And, you know, early on, both with ARB and the CEC, there was a significant amount of funding to really help to support more of that sort of R&D or the development stage. We've been seeing, you know, less and less of that, you know, as time has gone on, and that's really sort of a testament, if you will, to the commercialization of zero emission vehicles. But we also recognize that there are various sectors that maybe are not as far along on the commercialization, you know, sort of spectrum, if you will. And I think that, you know, ARB does recognize that too. And if you look at, so for example, the 40 million for, you know, off-road pilots, I would say that the word is used sort of as a pilot. So this is not necessarily a commercial vehicle in this sense, but rather a pilot. And so it's kind of those first vehicles or those first pieces of equipment that are being developed. So there are some programs that are still available, but they typically have a focus on a certain you know, equipment sector or vehicle sector that either ARB or the CEC identifies as an area that potentially needs that sort of additional support for pilots, or sort of more for those initial few vehicles. And so I think it would be something that we could definitely look into, depending on the type of vehicle or type of piece of equipment, in terms of what other incentives could be available. Our next slides are going to go into the CEC, and the CEC has also historically had funding for R&D and sort of more of the early pilots or demonstrations. And they have specifically competitive solicitations that they'll be developing. And so if there are certain spaces or sectors that is in need of sort of more R&D support or more pilot support, you know, I think that that would be something worthwhile to share, likely with the CEC first, and then potentially with ARB as well, depending on kind of where they are in that commercialization scale, and then specifically what pieces of equipment or vehicles.
Excellent. And then a related question, there's a question about, at what funding level in percentage of project costs. And, my experience has been that's very specific to the solicitation that's being let by the agencies in terms of kind of their assessment of, how close to commercial it is, and reflections of risk or stage of technology maturity. They will vary the level of percentage of cost share required. But could you maybe speak to that point a little bit as well?
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, it really depends program to program. So, for example, these 3 programs that are listed here are vouchers. So they cover, a certain dollar amount of the total cost of the piece of equipment or vehicle. And what ARB has tried to do, particularly within HOV and within CORE, is to really help to bridge that sort of incremental between the fossil fuel equivalent. So, for example, between, let's say a diesel transit bus and a zero emission transit bus, and try to sort of make that voucher to help bridge that gap between the two. And so that was sort of a way of, okay, these vehicles are commercial. We're going to help bring down that incremental cost by providing this voucher. And so that is really based on that mindset and sort of the cost difference between the two. Whereas, programs like, let's say the Clean Mobility in Schools or the STEP program or these, the back funding, the zero emission drayage projects, those had certain percentages of match funding required, or that you got additional points for the competitive solicitation to have match funding. And match funding can range anywhere between, 50% match required, 25% match required, or sometimes it's just simply states that you get additional points for having match, and then therefore you do provide some sort of percentage of match funding so that way you score, high enough to receive dollars. But that's typically how the competitive solicitations are done. And match can be things, like specifically like, the location that they're manufactured, or the employees that are manufacturing, that can all go into match funding. A lot of times air districts can help support match dollars. So there can be kind of, ways to help meet those match requirements without, let's say, identifying, a certain cash match amount, but rather, meeting that in kind or identifying other partners to provide the cash match.
Yeah, excellent. And I recall during the ARA days, there was the ability to secure both federal and state dollars, depending on how the state programs were funded, and the federal dollars could count as match towards the state dollars if they weren't, federally derived state programs. So, I mean, there's lots of innovative ways to meet match.
Yes.
So thanks for that response.
Anything else on the ARB programs before we transition to the California Energy Commission?
I don't see any more questions, Claire, on that.
Okay. I will hand this over to Charles to go through the Energy Commission's funding.
Thank you, Claire. As mentioned by both Ted and Claire, in addition to ARB, the California Energy Commission has also received a historic appropriation in funding for both infrastructure and manufacturing. Specifically, through their Clean Transportation Program, they're investing $1.4 billion over the next few years. Just to give some context, normally the Energy Commission receives about $100 million per year for this program. So it's a significant increase historically. Within this overall package, there's $670 million available for medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles. That includes $370 million this year and the remaining funds in the next 2 years. $330 million for light duty zero emission vehicle infrastructure, with $290 million available this fiscal year, and the remaining $40 million over the next 2 years. Additionally, there's $243 million specifically for in-state ZEV and infrastructure manufacturing. This will be over a 2-year period. Historically, the Energy Commission has received $5 to $10 million specifically for manufacturing. So this is a large infusion of investment to support job creation and economic development in the state. And then there's also funding for hydrogen infrastructure, as well as $25 million for near zero carbon fuel production. Next slide. So just digging into specifics a little bit more on these programs and funding. So the $670 million for medium and heavy duty infrastructure, as I mentioned, 370 will be available this year. This will be implemented both through the Energize program as well as competitive solicitations. The Energize program is a new program at CEC in partnership with CalSTART. It is currently under development, and they're actually supposed to be launching their website and initial implementation manual this month or early next month. The program will be both a first come, first serve, as well as competitive program to provide support to both businesses, transit agencies, school districts, as well as publicly accessible charging to support specifically medium and heavy duty infrastructure. They're in the process of developing the specifics on the program. We encourage folks that are not currently tracking this program to join their workshops and to be engaged as the details of the program are finalized. For light duty, funding has historically gone through the Cal EVIP program, also known as the California Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Project. This is administered with the Center for Sustainable Energy and is really a regional focused program. It provides support for publicly accessible light duty infrastructure, including at public workspaces or multifamily living. And it's really available on a regional basis. Most California counties currently have funding availability, but the Energy Commission is working to expand it to be a fully available statewide program. And it currently has funding available, and this will really just be additional to the program that has been operating for a couple of years. As I mentioned on manufacturing, they will have $118 million available this fiscal year, followed by $125 million available next year. This program will support both light, medium, and heavy duty vehicles and infrastructure. They are proposing to split the funding between manufacturing for both complete vehicles, vehicle components, batteries, as well as charging infrastructure, both electric and hydrogen. The program is currently the solicitation for this year is currently under development. They held their most recent workshop last month and are expected to release a solicitation this month or January, with an application deadline likely in March or early April.
Hey, Charles, sorry to interrupt. On the manufacturing program, we've gotten a lot of interest from CMC clients, early stage companies that are looking at bringing products to market, in particular to this pot of money in this program. And you spoke to how they're looking at splitting it up into vehicles and vehicle subsystems, et cetera. Do you expect that that these will all be competitive solicitations in each of those areas, and or that they'll run the solicitations by those different segments, or do you expect that they'll run solicitations for the aggregate and you just apply for whichever particular area your particular project is focused on?
Charles, we could probably take that just because Ted and I spoke to the folks from the CEC just last week. So, likely what they're going to be doing, recognizing a lot of the feedback that they got from folks, is that they're going to be having the solicitation itself include all three. So include the infrastructure as well as the vehicle and the batteries, and have that be eligible for whichever components you're doing. So recognizing that there are many vehicle manufacturers that are also doing their own infrastructure and that are also doing their own batteries. And so you wouldn't have to apply sort of separately within each pot. They are considering doing sort of a set aside pot specifically for battery manufacturing to help sort of incentivize and drive that within California. And they're expecting to provide more information next month. So in January, with likely the first solicitation to be released in March. And so I think that we'll get more details come January, but just so that way folks are aware that it is likely going to be where it's a competitive solicitation. And if you do both vehicle and battery manufacturing and you want to apply for funding for both, that you're able to do so. And it's not sort of divided up into 3 different buckets.
God, that's fantastic. I know that's always a challenge as, as a proposer, is trying to figure out, what's the most applicable pot of money to go after. And sometimes there's trade-offs in being competitive. So I'm really happy to hear that they're thinking a little bit differently on how to structure the solicitations.
Yeah, and I think I'd also say they're really open to stakeholder feedback. So, if there are certain things that folks are interested in as it relates to manufacturing, whether it's for vehicles, infrastructure, for batteries, they're open to hear what really works best for the industry, because their whole goal is to really drive this industry here and to create more jobs and to create more manufacturing in the state.
Yeah, and as we know, I mean, certainly, submitting comment to them now is important, because once they issue solicitations, they go quiet. So perhaps we can find a link or provide a link to folks on where they could submit feedback to the CEC.
Yeah, we're glad to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Charles, I didn't mean to step in there, but we did just have a recent conversation that I wanted to provide information on.
No problem. I appreciate that. Just finishing up the last couple bullet points, as previously mentioned, that there's also funding specifically for hydrogen infrastructure, both on light and heavy duty side, as well as for near zero carbon fuel production. Historically, both of these programs have been administered through competitive solicitations, which we expect to continue this year. Next slide. And then we all just wanted to highlight some key components of the recently passed bipartisan infrastructure bill, specifically significant investment in both EV infrastructure as well as vehicle deployment. There is $7.5 billion for building out a national network of EV charging and fueling infrastructure. This is currently being developed by the Department of Transportation and the Secretary of Transportation, and we're eagerly waiting to see how this will get implemented, but it is a very large investment in EV charging nationwide. There's also major investment in cleaning up school buses, $5 billion to replace existing old diesel and other fueling buses with cleaner alternatives. Similar $2.5 billion on the ferry side to replace marine vessels. And also transit, over $5.2 billion going to the FTA's low-no program to support zero emission bus deployment. So I would say on the federal side, they're working through implementing the significant investment. It's probably a little bit behind where the state's at. A lot of these will be new programs and new funding, so it just takes a little bit more time to be implemented. But as details come out, we'll definitely share highlights and availability of the significant investment. I think we'll pause there if there are any questions.
Maybe a question on that last slide, Charles. Are there fiscal year constraints to these dollars that require them to be expended within a certain fiscal year at the federal level, or are these multi-year funds?
They are multi-year funds, but there are requirements on when funds can be expended by. I think it varies by program, but it is a few years out. I think overall the package is a 5-year package across the board. But in terms of encumbered states, we'll have to double check on the exact timelines, but it is supposed to be a 5-year rollout of these funds.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions from folks? I'll scan here. One question from Ralph. Is the state of California in any way dependent on having bipartisan support on a federal level for its electrification ambitions?
I can take a first stab at that. In general, California being a extremely blue state, as far as the overall, any state funding and others just requires the state legislature and the governor and the Department of Finance to support. So no, even the funds that flow through typically flow to entities like the Energy Commission historically, or to ARB or others, and then it would be staff dividing those up. So as a general rule, the state of California is just a legislative process, which is very much democratically controlled.
Thanks, Ted. We talked about ARB and the CEC. What maybe you guys could speak a little bit about the role of the air quality management districts and how that ties into some of these deployment focused initiatives, and maybe what the prospect is for their role in helping the state meet these investment objectives.
I can take a big picture first stab, and then I'll jump in. Especially for folks outside of California, we have the California Resources Board, ARB, which is headquartered in Sacramento, but then has offices down in El Monte and elsewhere. Southern California now, I think they've moved their office, but we have a statewide reach for the Air Resources Board, and ARB is in charge of all air quality policy, all mobile source, and putting together the state implementation plan that goes to US EPA to make attainment and to make progress and rate of progress toward clean air and criteria pollutants, which are things like particulate pollution as well as precursors for smog, both VOCs, NOx, etc. And then we have dozens of air districts throughout California, which loosely align with air basins, and their primary focus is stationary sources. So they regulate all of the permits for stationary source emissions. They also put together the plan that includes the mobility part and submit proposed air quality management plans for each area. And then they also oversee a number of their own programs. And so for incentives, in addition to being great partners for grants, especially looking at larger grants where oftentimes grants going to ARB, air districts oftentimes will partner with end users as well as manufacturers for zero emission deployments. And that's definitely one great opportunity, one to bring together regionally significant and other projects that are attractive to state solicitations, whether it's Air Resources Board, Energy Commission, or others. They also have community programs focused on benefiting disadvantaged communities, own dollars that flow through. They also have Carl Moyer, which has historically been modernization of diesel technologies, increasingly moving to zero, and oversee a number of other TAP programs, technology advancement programs, where there's some R&D. So the folks mentioned R&D. They've historically had some dollars, especially if there's a particular application where the market hasn't provided a clean alternative. They're relatively small, up to $500,000 technology advancement grants in order to fill those niches. I'm sure I'm missing some, but those are the first that come to mind. Claire, Charles, what did I miss?
Yeah, that was a great overview. So there are just a few other programs. So for example, there's what's called the Farmer Program that's also run by air districts, which is funding specifically for ag equipment. And then also the air districts have been responsible for administering the Volkswagen settlement funds. And so ARB, in conjunction with the air districts, has basically allocated funding to certain air districts to cover certain vehicle types. So for example, the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District is overseeing the funding for both transit and school buses for the Volkswagen settlement, whereas South Coast, I believe, is overseeing the trucks, and Bay Area is overseeing some of the charging equipment and some of the marine funding. So, so their air districts, do a lot of partnerships with ARB, and a lot of that comes to, ARB, as you saw today, is receiving a significant amount of funding this year, more than ever before, but in the past also has received a sizable amount of funding, whether it's from settlement dollars or from otherwise. And so those partnerships with the air district are important in terms of getting the dollars out quickly and to the communities that need it the most.
While we're on air districts, there are some unique ones. Some of the larger air districts, like South Coast AQMD, for example, has a program called the Mobile Source Reduction Committee, where they've historically given out $10 or $20 million long ago to natural gas, and now to primarily zero emission. And so each one has other programs, but that's a great suggestion, Mark. They're definitely one of the key partners, and they're definitely one for folks to look for opportunities. One other one is they have been involved in some of the federal dollars too, for the Diesel Emission Reduction Fund, the DERA funds. Many of those have been grants, kind of block grants, almost secured through air districts, where they'll bring together a consortium of technologies and then use that for medium duty zero emission vehicle deployments, et cetera. So they've been, in addition to partnering for state dollars, they're also a great partner for helping bring in federal dollars as well.
Talked a lot about partnerships, and in the context of partnering with these state agencies or these local governmental entities in the case of the air districts. But on the applicant side, maybe you guys could talk a little bit about partnerships. I know my time at the Energy Commission, partnerships were very important when you're going, particularly after competitive solicitations. Could you maybe give us some thoughts around partnering and your view on kind of the value of having broader partnerships for, I know it's all, solicitation specific, but maybe you could speak in general terms about partnering.
I'm glad to take a first stab at that. So, so overall, the key for partnering, one, it's always, I think, good for folks to have an extended network of different technologies and end users and folks are working with, but specifically for, let's say, the example of securing a competitive grant. A company on their own typically can't do deployment. So the very minimum, most of the dollars are focused on deployment. They'll need to, at a minimum, be a partnership between the end user, who's actually going to be deploying the vehicles, and who will be part of the reporting and gathering the data, the telemetrics. And so at a very minimum, you're going to need a technology provider and you need a end user. Oftentimes, just those two entities isn't as strong of a proposal of having experts. So if you look at most of the grant solicitations, experience in deployment is one of the highest scored part of the grants. In the end, if you don't get a high enough score, if you're not one of the top, usually 3-ish, depending on the grant, you're not going to get it. So if you have an experienced partner, both from a deployment standpoint and from a technology providing, you're going to score better. And oftentimes there are some places that aren't as strong in your team, and through partnering you can fill it in. So for example, if you don't have experience with data collection and others, you can bring in an entity that covers that role. If technology wise, if you have a missing link in your charging infrastructure, or something interesting on a storage component where you're overcoming some demand charges, all of those are attractive. One of the key things is to work backwards from a problem. Why is it we still have mostly internal combustion vehicles on the road? And if you can, through partnering and through really crafting a well-designed project that's attractive to the state or attractive to the federal agency or the air district, that whatever in the end makes the project better. And usually you have specialties, but usually you're not a one-person band. And so it really is filling out, so you've got a common chorus or hitting all the notes or whatever analogy you want to use. But through that, you can come up with the strongest overall proposal that really has a fundamental hurdle that this overcomes. And then in the end, you also, it matters how generalizable it is. Some end users are more influential. So at least historically, large end user fleets were attractive. because they had the wherewithal for folks to follow. If you're a little fleet, you kind of look over at one of the big companies and say, okay, what are they doing? And it's relatively safer as a fleet operator to follow what they're doing. There's a big focus, as Claire mentioned, on also helping some smaller deployments and others now for equity and other important criteria. But in the end, it's just being strategic on having a strong proposal. And a key part of that is partnering. So you have all of the right elements, you score the highest points for competitive solicitations. For vouchers and others, partnering is still important because you need an end user, but it's probably not quite as critical. I don't know, I defer to Claire and Charles for what I missed.
I think that was a great summary. The only additional thing I would add is, building on what you talked about for experience, we're seeing increasingly that ARB and the CEC are in the competitive solicitations looking at whether or not you have someone on your team that has experience administering grants before, because these tend to be really large scale projects and quite time intensive with invoicing and reporting and the final report. And so as Ted mentioned previously, whether it's partnering with air districts or other nonprofits that have had that experience before, that can help really round out your team, so that way the funding agency has more certainty in terms of they know that the folks that they're working with have sort of been down this road before, are familiar with this process, and that they'll have sort of good communication back and forth as the project works forward towards completion.
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead, Charles. Oh, I was gonna comment that, having managed tens of millions of dollars in grants when I was at the Energy Commission, and then in my time since with SMUD and now with the CMC, competing for grants, it really is an art to coming up with your grant strategy based upon what's being asked for. And so having, that expertise to help you kind of navigate that strategy to position you in the best light possible is really important. And I couldn't agree with you more, Claire, about the importance of the grant administration side of it, because in the end, you want to demonstrate, excellent performance with the funding agency, that you're delivering on your objectives and meeting your obligations under the grant. So, getting the grant is the first part, but I would argue is probably the easier part. Executing successfully on the grant is a lot more important, and having partners to support that is super important.
Building on that might be important just to note, that historically, again, this is unprecedented times with both state and federal funding. There's always, and even now, there's not nearly enough dollars to go around for all of the need. So say historically at an Air Resources Board or Energy Commission solicitation for a competitive grant for a zero emission deployment, there might be $1 for every $10 of requested grant. So maybe 1 in 10 received. So very, very competitive. That's why it's so critically important through partnering and through having an experienced team with a grant administrator and showing that this is going to be a successful grant to score higher than the other 9 out of 10. And from that, it's the approach has to be working backwards from really what's being requested. One, it's not applying for grants that aren't a good fit. That's not a good use of it to folks' time. If you're a company, especially a relatively early stage, a startup, or really any company, can't afford to spend a lot of time paddling in a direction that's not going to get you anywhere. So one, it really is really understanding what the solicitation is looking for, and being honest with yourself about how good of a fit it is. So if there's not a lot of overlap on that Venn diagram, find something else to apply for. That would be our first advice. But as long as it's a relatively good fit, then it's working backwards from the scoring criteria and really writing a proposal that really resonates with the reviewers. So oftentimes reviewers are all within that agency. Sometimes there are a few from the brother or sister agency. But either way, it has to be written in plain prose. So many times I'll see a proposal where someone just described what they want to do, and that doesn't work at all. Like, you have to have strong topic sentences, make really clear things that show redundancy. Some reviewers are skimming. So you really need to write the proposal in a way that really resonates with multiple eyes on it, different reviewers, and that when it reads backwards from scoring criteria, it was very carefully crafted to fit what proposal they're looking for and to be shaped into what the project is supposed to be. If you don't do that, you're very likely one of the 9 out of 10. You spend a bunch of time, or regardless of whether you get it, and you weren't successful, and there's not that opportunity for partnering with that agency. So it really is important to work backwards from specifically what's required, make sure you hit all the requirements, but also that you maximize points, working backwards from the scoring criteria, and really having strong, clear, really customized text that really resonates for exactly what they're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I completely agree with you on that, and have an affinity for these agencies rolling out these programs. Having sat on that side of the table, reviewing dozens of proposals at my time at the Energy Commission, when the programmatic dollar amounts were orders of magnitude smaller than what we're seeing today, and I think your point's well placed that their challenge is going to be even larger to really be able to get at the cream of what's coming into these proposals. And so it's very important to have good partners. The CMC can help with that. California Strategies can help with that. Other members within the CMC ecosystem and service providers can help with that. But the reality of it is, you're going to apply and you're going to lose. And I think it's equally important to take the time to reach out to those agencies and with a very open mind, and ask for constructive feedback. Because I think getting those insights of what they found as strong points of your proposals and weak points will just help position you to do better on the next one. And there's going to be a ton of solicitations out there. So I encourage people not to think of it as a one and done, but I don't know if you guys had any additional comments on those points.
Well, what I'd also say is, I think increasingly ARB and CEC is really recognizing how much work and effort goes into putting together these proposals. And so I think you probably noticed that within our presentation, particularly on ARB, that there were a number of pots of funding where they were back funding projects that weren't necessarily successful the first round, but maybe were those first few projects that didn't receive funding but still scored really high. And so even if you don't receive funding that first time, there could be opportunities with future funding and to back fund those projects, particularly if the team is still together the next year. There's still that need to demonstrate those technologies, and that's something that could be moved forward quickly, because then what it enables is it enables ARB or the CEC to get the dollars out more quickly for projects to help clean the air. And so it's discouraging when you are not successful the first time, but sometimes there's an opportunity for the project to still get funded the following year.
Thank you. Yes, I use that tactic actually myself at the Energy Commission. You may have the ability to fund 5 and 10 good proposals, all pass technical, rate well, but you can't go that low. And we're able to come back with augmentations of budget to reach down to the next 3 proposals. And from the agency standpoint, they've invested all that time and effort to run a solicitation, convene experts to evaluate them, and by all means, it is a good strategy to solicit feedback from the agencies with a very open mind, and just keep yourself positioned to potentially benefit from those additional dollars being augmented into those solicitations.
Mm-hmm.
We have just a couple minutes left. Here's a question around older diesel locomotives. There have been presentations by ARB on a proposed new regulation to create a forced savings account for older diesel locomotives. When or will this become effective?
I'm not familiar with that particular pod. I don't know if others are.
I think that's something we'd have to look into.
Okay.
That sounds like it's more on the regulatory side than the incentive side.
Okay.
We could look into that.
Let's see, I think we answered these other questions. So maybe any closing thoughts from you guys?
I would just say that, we've mentioned it a few times, the unprecedented funding amount, and that there's a number of workshops that are going to be coming up, both at ARB and the CEC. And for folks that are interested, I'd really encourage you to get on the listserv and to participate in those workshops and to reach out to staff, because they really do want to hear from folks within the industry, and specifically, help tailor those programs to be effective, to help deploy these vehicles and this infrastructure and manufacturing. And so it is important to engage in that process and to work with staff, but then, also recognize that, staff is giving out all of these dollars, and it's to support these companies and to really be appreciative and thankful for those dollars. And I think a thank you can go a long way. So that would be sort of one piece or two pieces of advice: is one, to engage, and two, to say thank you along the way too.
I just want to echo the thank you part. I think that, if you work at the resources board and you're giving out, all types of both vouchers, incentives, grants, very rarely do they get a big thank you. Oftentimes they hear from that 9 out of 10 folks that didn't get it. They're upset that they didn't get it, or someone that they didn't get their dollars soon enough, or that they're having issues with on the accounting side. And so, I can't emphasize enough how important it is for, we collectively as the ZEV community to say thank yous for all the dollars that have been provided, and for the people who are giving out those dollars and doing the very best they can to have as much public benefit, to clean the air, and most GHG benefits, protecting disadvantaged communities, you name it. It's not an easy job. And again, folks that as you mentioned before, Mark, the work begins when you get the grant. So you don't get a whole lot of thank yous after that. And then all the people who didn't get it are upset they didn't get it. So it's a difficult space. So I just wanted to echo and bolster Claire's comment.
Excellent. Well, Charles, any closing thoughts?
I think Ted and Claire summarized it well. So.
Well, as always, CalStrat team, you guys are experts at what you do, and the CMC certainly values our partnership with you, as I know many of our clients do. And I really want to thank you for a very informative presentation today on where the investments are being made. And I'll turn it back over to Catherine.
Thank you, Mark. Once you exit the webinar, please take a moment to complete the short survey that will pop up on your screen. Thank you. This concludes today's CMC webinar.